If you were Chancellor again, what's the first tough decision you would make?
Welfare reform. It's as simple as that. And then public sector productivity. We have to have a strategic approach to reducing debt. One of the reasons public finances are in a bad way is because our debt interest is now, going to be more than £100 billion this year. And that means basically saying that we will always grow public spending by less than growth in the economy. That means being very challenging when it comes to productivity and also taking difficult decisions when it comes to welfare.
We're speaking on the eve of Rachel Reeves' second budget. And if there's one thing we do know ahead, it's that taxes are definitely going up in one form or another. Does that need to happen?
No. And that is the central trade-off, which frankly we should be discussing a lot more, because there's a very big choice that Rachel Reeves has made, which is not to reform welfare, and therefore taxes are going to have to go up. And if you want to keep the tax burden stable, and I personally think that we need to bring the tax burden down, if we want to allow businesses the headroom to invest and to grow the private sector in the economy, which is the bit that funds everything else. There are really two things you can do. One of them is improve public sector productivity so that you get more bang for your buck when it comes to the public services that taxes fund. And we should definitely do that, but it does take time. And that's not something that's going to happen overnight. But the thing that you can do, which the Office for Budget Responsibility would recognise in their numbers, is bring the working age welfare bill down to the level it was before the pandemic. That would save around £47 billion a year, which would mean that taxes would not have to go up. And indeed, Rachel Reeves would have a lot more headroom in terms of her numbers.
Of course, Rachel Reeves did try, not perhaps to do something even that ambitious. They did try to do some welfare reforms, relatively modest ones. They tried to do even as just a kind of symbolic thing to take away the winter fuel payment. And that caused huge problems, and they just couldn't get it through. So are these things really realistic for her?
Well, I don't know if they're realistic for a Labour Party or not, but they are what the country needs. And I would say this, that they went about those changes in wholly the wrong way. I mean, you are never going to persuade a Labour Party and Labour MPs who see themselves as campaigners for social justice to cut back benefits for poorer people in order to balance the Treasury's books. That is not the right argument. The argument that we need to be making is that it is immoral if someone has anxiety or depression, and now more than half the people who are signed off having to look for work are doing so for mental health reasons. It is immoral that we park those people on welfare where less social contact may well mean that their mental illness gets worse, rather than treat that mental illness at a fraction of the cost. And that's what we should be doing. And, you could double the number of people getting treatment for anxiety or depression in the NHS, double it, and it would cost an extra £1 billion out of £47 billion that you would save if you got that welfare bill down to 2019 levels.
Yeah. Just returning to tax for a moment. So one of the things that we think is almost certainly going to happen is that Rachel Reeves, having refused to do it last time around, is now going to extend the freeze on income tax thresholds through to 2029, 2030. That, of course, is something that you also did as Chancellor. You extended it from the initial policy that Rishi Sunak brought in when he was Chancellor. What's the difference between now and then?
Well, there's a difference in the situation and there's a difference in philosophy. So the difference in the situation was that in 2022, we were coming out of COVID, where we'd spent £350 billion to support businesses and families through the pandemic. And we also were in the middle of an energy crisis caused by the invasion of Ukraine, where we knew that we had to help families who wouldn't be able to pay their energy bill over winter, potentially costing us nearly another £100 billion more. Now, those are the right things to do. We had potentially risked mass unemployment if we hadn't had things like the furlough scheme or the bounce back loans and so on. But they cost money and they have to be funded. But for Rishi Sunak and me, raising tax was a temporary necessity, but the long-term trajectory should always be to bring taxes down to make us more competitive as a country. Compare that to Rachel Reeves, where she doesn't have those immediate factors to fund. And the choice that she's making is not to reform welfare. In fact, I think we're going to see welfare spending going up in this budget because she doesn't want to constrain public spending at all. And because she doesn't have the same belief that I have, that if you look around the world, the fastest growing economies, whether it's in Asia or North America, are ones which tend to tax a lower proportion of GDP.
Do you think, I mean, as you say, there were big reasons as to why it happened, but it was under the Conservatives that taxes did end up going up to historic levels. The tax code became more complicated over time. Higher owners were being hit more. Do you think for the public they're less convinced now, or the brand has been damaged of the Conservatives as a low-tax party? Do you think they can win that back?
Well, it was obviously difficult to win that argument in 2024, only 18 months or just under 2 years after we had to put up taxes. But, Geoffrey Howe put up taxes in 1981. George Osborne put up taxes in 2010. Conservatives have to stand for fiscal responsibility. But the difference between Conservatives and Labour is that when we can, we then try and bring the tax burden back down. Geoffrey Howe was followed by Nigel Lawson, who brought taxes down. George Osborne actually significantly reduced the state's share of GDP. And I made a start with the national insurance cuts, the introduction of full expensing for business. Those tax cuts reduced tax as a proportion of GDP by just under 1%, but I wanted to go further as and when we could afford to, and it would have been responsible to do so.
What do you think of Kemi Badenoch's proposal to take away stamp duty?
Well, I think it's one of a number of tax cuts that could help stimulate the economy. I mean, I'm very worried that the opposite is going to happen in Rachel Reeves's budget, which is if she introduces higher bands of council tax on more expensive properties, I think that is going to gum up the top end of the property market in the way that the 15% stamp duty currently does. And a thriving property market is one of the things that gets economic activity going. And also, by the way, brings in quite a lot of tax revenue. So, I think, Kemi's absolutely right to look at taxes like stamp duty that are a brake on social mobility. They stop people moving to where the jobs are, as well as a brake on the housing market.
You're starting to get into the sort of territory of growth, which seems like the thing we really need in the economy fundamentally, because it's just sort of flatlining along. Now, Labour, of course, came in saying they were all about growth. They were going to get the growth, and that was going to sort of make the numbers work for them because they wouldn't. They could use growth to have extra tax revenue, and then they wouldn't need to pare back the spending quite so much. It hasn't happened. They've done some good things, perhaps, on infrastructure, building. They've talked a good game, done a little bit of planning reform and so forth. Why hasn't it worked for them? What have they got wrong?
Because they haven't practiced what they preached. I mean, they talked about growth, but then they raised taxes by £40 billion. They've introduced a rise in employers' national insurance, the new workers' rights bill, which has basically meant that payroll jobs have gone down by 180,000, unemployment has gone up, inflation has gone up. They've done all the things that you shouldn't do if you want to unlock growth in the economy. Now, it's not easy, and one of the biggest reasons why a chancellor's job is hard is that all the really good things you can do to unlock growth don't tend to take effect or don't tend to be reflected in the numbers until 3 or 4 years after you do them. Kind of supply side measures, for example, reforming the planning system. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do them. And if you are a new government with a large majority, that is the time. I think the planning reforms have been very timid. We have had nothing on public sector productivity. We've had a lot of talk about being an AI superpower, but no evidence that I can see that we're really bringing in AI at speed into public services like the NHS, which is, a big opportunity, as that's 10% of our GDP. And so for me, this is the thing that I would like to see in Rachel Reeves's budget. I know we're in a very tricky corner right now, and we won't get out of that through one speech by the Chancellor, but what we want is a plan. We want to see how we are going to get out of our low growth trap. And I fear instead by hiking up taxes, we're going to dig ourselves deeper into it rather than emerge from it.
Yeah, and of course it's not just about hiking up taxes in general, but how you do it. And there was, initially it looked like there was going to be a plan to do something quite bold and break the manifesto commitment and hike the headline rates of income tax. That's now been reversed quite rapidly, and it now looks like we're going to get a sort of smorgasbord of smaller fiddly tax rises across the board as well. Would you say that's a worse approach if you're going to have to raise taxes?
Well, most economists would say that it's more distortive if you try and raise a lot of smaller taxes. As we were just talking about, for example, that higher rates of council tax on more expensive properties. I mean, there's no doubt the council tax system needs modernisation. It's based on 1991 valuations. It's got lots of inconsistencies in it. But if you're going to do like a piecemeal reform like that, it could be very distortive of the property market in London and the southeast. And then you could have, other tax rises on, pension saving that could reduce the amount of saving in the economy. That is something that would be very regrettable when, one of the big changes we need as an economy is to be investing more relative to the amount we consume. So, I mean, that is always the argument. That said, I welcome it if they're not putting up income tax because, I don't want to see income tax go up. And I think that would also be negative for growth.
Do you think part of the challenge is convincing the public of what needs to happen? I mean, the public might, I suppose, like the idea of not putting up taxes, but they probably don't like the idea very much of cutting spending. Zach Polanski's success seems to suggest that the public seems to think that actually there are probably some rich people somewhere that we can tax a little harder and that'll pay for everything. Do they really want to hear what we need is growth, and that means that we need to pare back public spending, not raise taxes? Is that a politically winnable message?
Well, left-wing parties have done a very good job of turning austerity into a thoroughly dirty word. And I think it's really important that we unpack what we are prepared to do and aren't prepared to do. So I think a Conservative government or a Conservative party in opposition should say that we will not cut the services that the public rely on, having good schools or hospitals or police forces or armed forces. These are vital public services and we want them to improve. And we should say our objective is to get them to improve. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to try and run them more efficiently. And I think it's really important that we do run them efficiently. I think we should say, for example, that in the public sector, we are only prepared to give above inflation pay rises if they are funded through productivity improvements. We should have a plan that gets public sector productivity improving every year at the 2% of GDP, which is the 2% growth rate that is the long run growth rate in the private sector. It's actually been declining since over the last 2 decades. So I think those are really good things. And I think you can make a very good argument to the public that if you don't do that, you're going to be putting up taxes in budget after budget, which the public don't like, and you're actually going to be risking the future of these services and risking having to do those cuts that no one wants. So this is a way to make public services that we all want sustainable.
Yeah. One of the things that the public are really feeling at the moment is the cost of living. Inflation's high, food inflation's very high, energy prices and so on. Rachel Reeves is, we understand, planning to address this in the budget in various ways. There's talk that she's going to freeze rail fares, for example. How do you think a Conservative government should approach that challenge?
Well, I think cost of living is obviously a major concern. We did an enormous amount on the cost of living. We gave people, for example, reductions in their energy bills. when the energy prices spiked, we kept the fuel duty freeze. We made cuts to some of the duties in items like, I think we had a cut in beer duty in one budget. So we completely recognise this, but there's absolutely no point in having measures that help people with the cost of living if at the same time you increase employers' national insurance so that they try and pass on the cost of that to their customers through higher prices. And that's what has happened this time. So I think Rachel Reeves is late to the party on the importance of having low and stable prices. And sadly, under her chancellorship, we've risen to having the highest inflation in the G7. I think it's predicted to be the highest this year and next. And what does that mean? It means that interest rates will stay higher for longer. It means that mortgages will be more expensive for families that have mortgages. And therefore, it means their cost of living is going to be higher than it should be.
One of the biggest, I think, extra spending commitments that's coming in the budget is taking away the two-child benefit cap. This is an interesting policy politically because Nigel Farage and Reform UK have actually come out and said that they also think that this should be scrapped. But out in the country, the public are actually surprisingly, or perhaps surprisingly, are in favour of retaining the cap on this. And Kevin Badenoch has come out and said that if the Conservatives come back into office, the next election they would reverse this and reinstate it. Do you think that's good politics? Is there a way that she can actually draw a line between her and not just with Labour but with Reform as well?
It's completely the wrong policy to scrap it. It costs £3 to £4 billion onto the welfare budget that's already exploding. But on top of that, it is both unfair and immoral. And the reason it's unfair is because what you're doing is saying that people on benefits automatically get more benefits the more children they have. In other words, they don't have to make the trade-offs that people in work have to make when they decide to have a larger family. They have to reckon on the fact that it costs more to bring up an additional child. And I think people on benefits should have those same trade-offs that people in work have, and that is unfair to people in work. But it's also immoral because, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies said in a very detailed piece of work that they published recently, it makes no discernible difference to the life chances of children brought up in families on benefit. But actually what it will mean, you can say there'll be a mechanical reduction in child poverty because you're giving extra money to a particular group of people. But if you ask, well, what are the root causes of poverty? One of the root causes of poverty is children growing up in a family where there are no adults working. And the number of children in absolute poverty fell under the Conservative governments from 2010, perhaps surprisingly, given this big narrative of austerity. But why did child poverty fall in that period? It's because the number of workless families, the number of families where children were growing up without either parent working, fell by 1 million. The number of children in workless families fell by 1 million after 2010. And that, of course, is tackling one of the root causes of poverty, and therefore poverty fell. And this is going to take us in the opposite direction.
These are extraordinary political times. I mean, Labour's coming up to this budget, but they're very, very unpopular despite having been elected with a landslide only very recently. But the Conservatives are also still not doing very well in the polls at all. That doesn't really seem to shift very much. Reform UK are riding high. There's been some discussion in Conservative policy circles that economic credibility, really getting public spending under control and getting the economy growing again, is territory on which the Conservatives can win. It's like it should be their core offer. Do you think that's right? Do you think there is a sort of path back to power if the Conservatives can recapture this message?
Yes, I do. I think the more that Labour makes a hash of running the economy, the more the economy rises up people's list of concerns because, so much rides on economic success. I mean, if you're on the left and you want to spend more on public services, you need economic growth. If you're on the right and you want to reduce taxes, you need economic growth. And the Conservatives, Of course, we didn't get everything right in our time in office, but the fundamental thing you expect from Conservative governments is to take the tough and difficult decisions necessary to get the economy back on its feet. And we did that time and time again. In 2010, after the global financial crisis, when the previous Labour government had run out of money, in 2022, after the pandemic and the energy shock, we had inflation at 11%, we got it down to 2%. We had a Bank of England saying that the economy was going to have the longest recession in 100 years. We got it back to being the fastest growing in the G7. So people do understand that Conservative governments will take those tough and difficult decisions. And I think we all hope that a Labour government might be able to take some of those as well. But the U-turns on welfare cuts, the inability, so it would appear, to stand up to public sector unions in any area at all, suggests that this is not a government capable of those decisions. And I think, yes, that will make the Conservatives competitive again. People aren't going to flock back to us so soon after the last election, but over time, I think the state of the economy is going to become much more salient.
If you were Chancellor again, what's the first tough decision you would make?
Welfare reform. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. And then public sector productivity. I mean, in the end, we have to have a strategic approach to reducing debt, because one of the reasons public finances are in a bad way is because our debt interest is now, going to be more than £100 billion this year. And that means basically saying that we will always grow public spending by less than growth in the economy. That means being very challenging when it comes to productivity and also taking difficult decisions when it comes to welfare.
And just before we finish up, I discovered, I didn't know, that you have an ancestor, I think, who was also a chancellor, and that there's a story. He helped to create some of the pageantry that we still have on Budget Day today. I wondered if you'd like to tell that story.
Yes, I mean, when I became Chancellor, I was very much hoping that I would be the first person in my family to be Chancellor. And then I got a letter from Lord Burt, the former Director General of the BBC, who said, did I know that I wasn't the first Chancellor in my family, and that my great-great-great-grandfather's nephew was someone called George Ward Hunt. Lord Burt knew this because he now lives in George Ward Hunt's ancestral home. And I went, after I got this letter, and looked at the staircase in number 11, which has got pictures of the former chancellors. And halfway up, there's a picture of George Ward Hunt. He was Disraeli's chancellor in 1868. He only did one budget. And it was a bit infamous because he arrived at the House of Commons and he had forgotten his speech. And so he really annoyed MPs because he then had to go back to number 11 and get his speech. And then there was a general election, and perhaps because of that, Disraeli didn't reappoint him, and he was moved to First Lord of the Admiralty. And his successor, when he delivered his first budget, went outside the door of number 11 and held up the red box and shook it around in order to say, I've got a speech in here, don't worry, I haven't forgotten it. And that then became the tradition. So my ancestor was the cause of chancellors doing that ever since.
Great story. Jeremy Hunt, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mark.